Hi, my name is Lacey McCormick. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm with Jim Murphy. Jim, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jim Murphy. I'm Senior Director of Luga Advocacy for National Wildlife Federation. Good to see you, Lacey.
And we are here today to talk about wetlands. We are here today to talk about getting local media of what the impacts of the Sackett Supreme Court decision will be in each state. Jim, why do you think that we haven't seen much media of this? This is a very impactful decision, and yet we haven't seen a lot of media coverage of it. Why do you think that is?
I think on the federal level, we have seen some. I think it's been buried under a lot of other headlines. We've obviously had a lot going on in the last year, including some other big Supreme Court decisions like Dobbs that got an enormous amount of attention. I think the other reason is that, a lot on the local level and at the ground level, um, a lot of these impacts I don't think have been really articulated and understood yet. So I think a challenge and an opportunity we have is illustrating what the impacts are going to be on the ground because they're huge, and I just don't think the news media has heard that yet.
So, what do you think a local group would need to move forward with getting some media coverage of the impacts in their state or the potential impacts in their state?
I think it's really describing both what the threat is, what the decision did, but then tying that to the type of resources and also the type of water concerns that you have in your region or your community. The decision removed a lot of protections for wetlands that are not directly next to other waters. For a lot of regions, you have things like prairie potholes and playa lakes and vernal pools, and even wetlands that are in floodplains or very near rivers, but might be separated by a road or a berm. And these wetlands play enormous functions, and they're all at risk. And pointing that out to local reporters, where those resources are, the type of resources that are there. And then there's streams too, because the decision had major impacts on streams. EPA is estimating that between over 1 to almost 5 million miles of stream have been removed from jurisdiction. And nationwide, there's a recent study that shows that this accounts for over 50% of where drinking water originates. And particularly in regions out west where you have a lot of dry streams, there's a lot of opportunity to point to all those streams that don't run very often, that oftentimes only run when it rains or when the snow melts, and show that all those streams may no longer be protected. And that's a big deal in a lot of areas of the country.
So, in another video, we talked about how the stream study kind of gives local groups a way to talk about the magnitude of impacts in each kind of river basin. The study gives a lot of specifics. But with wetlands, we don't have necessarily that one study. How do you recommend that local groups go forward with, walking out with some kind of estimate of the magnitude of the impact in the absence of a definitive thing to point at?
I mean, there are some numbers that we have that give a general sense of what the impacts of the decision are. EPA, when they announced a rule that was designed to comply with the Sackett decision, stated that about 63% of wetlands nationwide would no longer be protected, wetlands that had been protected. So I think it's pretty safe to say that well over half of wetlands are no longer protected, or up to 3/4 of wetlands or 2/3 of wetlands are no longer protected. I think those are numbers that can be packaged and shown to a reporter, so that way they have some sort of estimate of what the loss is. And then kind of region specific, I think you're pretty safe to say if you're in an area where, for instance, somewhere like the Great Plains, where you have a lot of wetlands that are depressional wetlands that are not near other waters, that number is probably higher.
Right. So, but starting within a range of about somewhere between a half to
Yeah,
2/3, excuse me, and then looking at your state to kind of know where you should go from there.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So I think in pretty much most states, even some of the states that are more humid, um, I think half is pretty safe. And another number that the EPA put out uh, back when the Trump administration put together a rule that uh, kind of looked like the impacts of Sackett, but actually wasn't quite as bad. And that
Right.
estimate then was over 50%. So, even a rule that was not as bad as Sackett still removed 50% of wetlands. So, I think up to 2/3 is a very safe number to tell reporters.
Right. And just I work on media, and I can tell you that reporters would like to know this number in a fairly general. They don't really want it to the acre anyway. If you did give them that number, they would then turn it into about half, right? That's how
Yes.
they typically report on things, because people don't necessarily understand the specifics. There's a lot of research showing that people get confused by very complicated numbers. So they would try to keep that number as simple as possible. Um, Now we have some resources in the slide that accompanies this video. There is some data on how many wetlands there are in each state. And there's, you can certainly look at that if you really want to take the time to come up with as precise an estimate as possible. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that nobody has a particularly precise estimate at this time, down to the, percentage point.
Yeah, nobody has a precise estimate, and I think the more localized you get, the harder it is to really figure out what the exact impacts are, because to really know, uh, you have to have determinations kind of on a wetland by wetland basis. So when you zoom out to 30,000 feet, you can get a pretty, I think, close estimate of what the overall impacts are. But on a region by region basis, it gets a little harder to tell. But I think we can safely use the 2/3 number, and I think we can safely say that pretty much everywhere in the country, um, at least from a federal perspective, a large number of wetlands, well over half, have likely lost protection.
Um, so reporters will want to know the order of magnitude, but then the next question they're going to ask is sort of like, well, so what does that mean, right? What will that impact? So how can folks figure out, where we talk a lot about flooding with, wetlands, that they absorb a tremendous amount of floodwaters, because they do.
Yes.
So how can folks talk about the impacts to communities that are at risk of flooding on the ground?
Well, there are some numbers you can use. Like an acre of wetlands stores about 1 to 1.5 million gallons of acre feet of water, um, which is huge. Which is a lot of water that when you have these increasingly large precipitation events, that's all water that stays on the landscape and doesn't end up in your towns and communities. Um, Also, the economic value in general of wetlands is huge. I think EPA has estimated that wetlands have something like $1 trillion worth of value annually. Um, so those are good numbers to use. I think you can also just generally talk about every acre of wetland you have upstream is a storage place where when you have a storm, that water does not flow downstream. So you take 1 million gallons of water and you multiply that times however many acres in your community's watershed, and that's a lot of water that may be the difference between minor flooding and catastrophic flooding.
Right. And you might also want to look at places that have flooded in the past.
Yeah.
And, you can talk about, well, all these wetlands were actually providing a lot of, and if we saw a repeat of that same storm, that would be, it would be much worse without those wetlands protecting it. You could do that. You could try to peg that to an anniversary of a flood, for example,
Exactly.
if one had happened. And on the
Yeah. And
contrary, I've seen a lot
I
of
was just gonna say,
stories. Sorry,
yeah,
you go,
sorry.
Deb.
I was just gonna say also on the other side of that, and you might have been going here, in places like Houston, that's destroyed a lot of its wetlands. When it's had some major storms like Harvey, those areas that used to be wetlands became wetlands again. And unfortunately, there were a lot of homes and businesses and other um, and other properties in that area that got hugely damaged.
There's no question. Yeah. Um, I've also seen some stories where they flip it around to sort of they put a spotlight, local news reporters often are looking for positive news, and we're
Yes.
often dishing out gloom and doom, right? So you can turn the gloom and doom into a positive angle if you talk about a wetland, if you kind of make a hero out of a wetland and you tell
Yes.
the story of how a specific wetland is, really doing a great job for your community and that it's protecting it. That is a really nice positive angle that reporters would like. And they also like to get out on the ground and, look at something if you could possibly take them there. That's also a really good angle. Another way to take this same kind of gloom and doom story is to tell a story of someone who's fighting for wetlands protection. A friend of mine is he's a producer, a digital director at a large large regional television chain. And he says that they have a hard time reporting on these kind of policy stories because they feel that it's very partisan and they are very strictly, measured. They're specifically measured on being nonpartisan. And so that if they can spin a story into a story about an advocate, then it's a feature and a profile of a person, and they're not taking it on as their agenda. And the reason that I mention this is that I do think that TV, it's interesting that they are so concerned about not appearing partisan, at least the station that he works for. Because we've also seen a lot of research that local TV news is the most trusted source of news about the environment. So, so I'm always trying to figure out how you can talk about this very complicated and potentially partisan, except for that in the messaging research information, we'll talk about how people don't see it as partisan, but the politicians see it as partisan. How can you take it back to what it is that people are connecting with about this issue? And so those are some of the ways you can just point to positive. You can take the negative and try to spin it into a positive if possible.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, another great example of a place where like wetlands and watershed protection is benefiting a community, and it's a big community, is New York City and their drinking water supply, because they've done a
Right.
great job of protecting the wetlands and the streams, actually quite a bit far from New York City, up in the Catskills. And as a result, they've been able to provide 8 million people clean drinking water at a very low cost because all of those wetlands are doing the work of treating the water and keeping it clean. So wetlands do a lot of work for us, and they do it quite cheaply.
So one element that we know that there's a lot of interest in is trying to connect this issue to how it affects consumers' pocketbook impacts.
Yes.
So we've seen all across the country that the states that are getting hit over and over again with these extreme weather disasters, they're seeing homeowners insurance rates skyrocket. So that is also another frame that, there's not a ton of specific facts and figures. We do in the resources of the slide, we do point to one study that provides some pretty specific information. But I think that this is it's a good angle to generally tie it to. Because of course, it's generally true. If places are, experiencing a lot of claims, then their costs will go up.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there was just a recent figure that came out that since 2023, we've experienced more in inflation-adjusted terms, billion-dollar storms in terms of damage than we did in the entirety of the 1980s. So, these storms are getting more frequent and more expensive. And, the investments we put in prevention are pay back way more than trying to rebuild after the disasters come. So, I think a real message to communities from an economic perspective, and a lot of communities are facing these costs, and these costs get passed on to to homeowners and to businesses, and is that by investing in preserving wetlands and other natural resources that mitigate flood damage, that is the best way to avoid those costs and be able to invest dollars in, in true growth and true economic activity, rather than, rebuilding from storm after storm after storm.
Yep, that just makes sense to me. I think the thing that I would just like local groups to know is that I believe that we haven't seen a lot of coverage of this on the local level. In the toolkit, you'll see a lot of examples from North Carolina. That's because North Carolina had a lot of sort of legislative and other action related to this. But people do, ultimately, we want to have stronger federal protections. Failing that, good state backstops in each state. But we can't get those if we aren't messaging about it in a way that makes sense to people, and that we aren't able to kind of make any noise about it at all, which is kind of what's been happening in a lot of states. There's just really been very little coverage.
Yeah, and the opportunities are really plentiful. I mean, we've talked a lot about flooding and the flood protection values of wetlands. We've talked a little about the clean water values of wetlands. It not just helps communities provide clean and safe drinking water to everyone. It's really kind of the first and in some ways most effective part of the water treatment system for clean water. And also just, I think we need to emphasize how special some of these places are. They're places of immense beauty, of tremendous wildlife. The opportunities for birding and other wildlife observations are huge there. They're just wonderful pieces, and for communities that know them and experience them, and there are places where people can go and kind of get away. I think telling those stories is important as well.
Yeah, I do too. Well, thanks so much. And please take a look at the entire toolkit. And my contact information is at the bottom of the toolkit. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you
Great.
so
Thanks,
much.
Lacey.